Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We are so excited to be hosting another Collegewise webinar on extracurricular planning. And we're going to be really diving into what admissions officers are actually looking for when it comes to the activities section. So I do have two incredible speakers joining me this evening, and we are going to dive into some of the nitty-gritty of things. We do have quite a few people already tuned in. But as we wait for a few more to log on, I am going to launch a quick poll, and I'd love to hear from all of you in the audience, who you are, what grade you're in, what you're looking for. So feel free to participate in that poll. With that, I am going to chat about Collegewise. So for those of you who are tuned in for the first time, and this is your first ever Collegewise webinar, we are so excited to have you join us this evening. So what is Collegewise and what do we do? So what we do and what we love to do is work with families and really create a stress-free experience for them. And really we want to give them a hug when it comes to the college admissions process and really help them navigate the application. So we know it can be a daunting task, especially doing it by yourself. So we're really here to provide that extra pair of hands and that support that students may need when it comes to building out that application, submitting it, and everything else in between. So at Collegewise, we've worked with over 26,000 students, and we've seen a 97% acceptance rate to students who have applied to at least one of their top 3 schools. And Collegewise students are 4 times more likely to gain admission to their dreams university versus the average applicant. So a little bit about Collegewise. So hopefully you will keep those numbers in mind as we move through the presentation. So with that, I do want to say before we start that this webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive the recording after we finish it. So please do keep an eye out in your spam or in your email. A recording will be sent to you from one of our team members. And also we will be hosting a live Q&A at the end of the session. So if you do have any questions for our speakers at any point throughout the presentation, feel free to pop that into our Q&A and we will get to that at the end. So with that, I am going to pass the microphone over to our first speaker, Anjali, and she will introduce herself to all of you today.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone so much for making the time to join us tonight. I'll start off with who I am and then I'll give you a bit of background about why this topic means so much to me. So I'm currently the CEO of Collegewise. I came on board in January and I was very inspired by the mission of really being the trusted source of information for students and families going through the admissions process. And our true goal is to take stress out of this and bring joy back into college admission. So every student can be their best self and do their best work in high school and then get into the university that's right for them. So I'll take you back to the early 2000s when I was in high school. My high school had mandatory volunteer hours, and I went to a couple of them. And, you know, with students, everything was a bit of a game, right? How could you be more competitive? How could you get more of these volunteer hours? And I realized after observing a couple of the volunteering sessions that we weren't really making an impact at all. You know, the nonprofits we were at, they would just set up a couple of tasks for us. Maybe we'd pat ourselves on the back afterwards, and it was this huge hurrah. And I felt like there was a bit of a disconnect for students to actually find a cause that they cared about and do something around. So I took a cause I really cared about, which at the time was the genocide in Sudan. And I asked my principal if I could speak about it. And she said, sure. So I went up there, I did this presentation, which is very, you know, hard to do when you're a teenager. And I had all these students come up afterwards and they were just curious, you know, how did you learn about this? How can you actually make an impact on something like this? And so I realized that students weren't apathetic when it came to volunteering. It was more that people didn't have a chance to be connected to causes they cared about, or you know, very few people were given the tools to actually make an impact. So I worked with a couple of leading social entrepreneurs and came up with a curriculum around social entrepreneurship. And it was a DVD, so we were actually getting these into high schools around the country. So starting from my very early days, back when there were DVDs, I very much always cared about helping students get connected to something that they find meaningful and then do work where they're actually learning skills and they're contributing to society when it comes to extracurriculars. And so my path has gone through education in a lot of different ways before Collegewise, but always centered around the high school student and how you as a student or you as a parent can equip your student to really find something you're interested in and do more with that. So I'll pass it to Daniel.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anjali. Yeah, I'm also, I think, similarly really passionate about the mission of Collegewise. So, my role here today is to share with you that, expert insider perspective. So I'm a recent former admission officer at 3 universities. We'll talk a little bit more about those, as well as an actual K-12 college counselor. So I kind of went back to school all over again once I, was working for a little while. So that's a really fantastic experience. But I think, one of the things that I think is really fantastic about an organization like Collegewise is I've always just really admired from afar how it really values the whole student and the whole person. And that's one of the things that I'm probably the most excited to talk to you guys about today, because I was a first generation college student myself. I was also on full need-based financial aid. So there was a lot of kind of like figuring out things as I went along. And I wish I had kind of stepped back, smelled the roses a little bit, because actually that probably would have made my application a little bit better, to be perfectly honest. Because a lot of what you do and how you spend your time should be a reflection, of course, of maybe the college you want to go to, or how competitive you are as a student, but also just the things that you really like and the things that you really care about. So I'm really excited because I think that we'll be able to give you some insight into, what it means to actually spend your time meaningfully and how that can also translate into stronger college applications. So I've been doing this now for about 12 years. So yeah, really excited to kind of walk through the agenda and share a little bit more about the process.
Awesome. Thanks, Daniel. So for all of you in the audience, short story, you're definitely in good hands this evening. Our speakers are absolutely incredible and definitely know the admissions process inside and out. So with that, we are going to kick off the first question, which I'm sure many parents and families have on their minds, is what is the role of extracurriculars? What role do they play in the college application and why are they important? So Daniel, I'd love to start with you. If you can provide us with the admissions officer perspective on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if I could really sum it up in one particular phrase, it's just how does a person spend their time, excluding, going to school, studying for classes, doing homework, that kind of stuff. So, outside of kind of what's required, what is a student doing? And I think that there's a lot of talk about, you see the word passion a lot, right? Or like, what are you committed to? And I think that's important. Colleges nowadays, they want to see this it's all going to come together in a resume. They want to see your extracurricular activities, maybe one or two point in a particular direction, to give the college a sense of what is the thing maybe that's most interesting to you. Where do you really kind of walk the talk? But I really love thinking about it as just how does a person spend their time? Because I think if you know any seniors, for example, if you're a current high school student, there's some who seem to be like doing everything and are amazing at everything. And that's fantastic if you can offer that in the college process. And that's kind of, where you are in life. But the role they really play is to try and give the college a sense of what kind of community member is this person going to be, right? And maybe what is the one or two things that they're, really committed to. I hesitate to use the word passion. I think that passion should be organic, and not contrived. But I think that, for example, if you kind of look at your own life and do a self-reflection and say, wow, like, I didn't think I was really into art or music, but I've been spending a lot of time, like, practicing my guitar, or, I've joined like choir and band this year or something like that. I've gotten really interested in this. That's probably maybe a direction you want to develop a little bit more because you're just naturally interested in it. and you have a higher chance, of course, of building up leadership skills or achievements that you can put on your resume. But again, colleges are really diverse places. So they need, for example, people who are multifaceted, a little well-rounded, but with like usually one or two things that kind of stand out in their own individual profiles so that they can get a sense of who this person is. So it's an important part of the process. If I had to put a number on it, we usually like to say it's about like a third of how your application is considered, just how you spend your time outside of school. But I think they're, like I said, important beyond the admissions process because they also are just great as like human beings, right? You don't want to just go to school to stay in class all the time. I think it's also really important to be doing things that you actually like and challenging yourself to maybe get that leadership opportunity or start something new or put a little twist, on something you're already doing. And all those things, of course, still translate really nicely into the college admissions process and making you kind of stand out a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up passion. That's definitely something that students struggle with, their passion versus what their friends might be doing or what their parents want them to do. So, Anjali, I'd love to hear from you when it comes to supporting students in the extracurricular section. How do Collegewise counselors approach that and play to the students' strengths?
I always like to talk about what's, joked about as the airport test. So if you were stuck next to someone and their flight was delayed, or both of your flights were delayed, what would you talk about? And it's sort of what admissions officers are thinking. Hey, if I'm in the dining hall and there's a student who sits next to me, can we have a conversation on something that's interesting? Does the student come alive when speaking about something? And so I'd say it's challenging when you're in high school to figure out something that you are very excited by and you want to spend a lot of time on. But students figure out how to do it by perhaps joining more clubs when they first start ninth grade or exploring more earlier years in high school. And then what you really see as that demonstrated commitment is where they're spending more time. They've spent more hours in that activity. They take leadership positions because they want to give back more. So I think it's a bit of showing to that university when you apply, hey, this is where I've chosen to spend my time. And that university then can say, oh, if I'm curating a dinner conversation in this dining hall, I have some students interested in this topic and some in this, and they're going to come together and get a chance to learn from one another, and then they're going on to become alumni who contribute to our broader community and go out to be the best in their respective fields in a lot of ways. So I think the universities, both they're thinking about how they can make the class experience the best it can be for each year, but then also how the people that they're tapping to hold their brand name on their sweatshirt or in their LinkedIn profile, how they represent that university to the world.
And I think one thing that families often forget is that admissions officers are people first. So they are humans, they have emotions. So Daniel, I'd love to hear from you. In your experience, when you were preparing for college, what approach did you take to extracurriculars and how does that impact how you evaluate them?
Yeah, I mean, I love what Anjali you said about that exploration piece. And chronologically speaking, for most students, it's more like before ninth grade and then ninth and 10th grade. It's very normal as an admission officer to see students, let's say, joining things and stopping things, trying things, because there's such a big world, right? Especially the shift from middle school to high school that you're suddenly exposed to. And how are you going to know, if you might be really good at debate or if you might really like the math competition club, unless you just join and you try it, right? So that's definitely something that admission officers really like to see. And it's something that I definitely, I feel like I had to do that a little bit in my own personal journey because like my parents are immigrants. So they were just like, okay, clearly you can like sort of figure this out. So just like good luck, right? Like we'll give you like food, and a roof at night, but like for the most part, we can't really help you. And I'm really lucky that I think I had that curiosity, just naturally speaking. And when I became a college counselor, it's something that I always encourage my students to do because I think nowadays there's just such an emphasis, right? Like universally on like what is popular or like what are other people doing? And it's very visible when you see it on social media. And I think, you feel so much pressure as a student nowadays. I felt that, but I'm sure the students in this, panel here, in this webinar feel it even more strongly than I did. And so I just always encourage students, especially in the younger years, like, don't be afraid to explore. Colleges are not going to penalize you for like joining something and stopping something. It's okay. Oftentimes, I can think of at least 5 different examples where we've actually really kind of been swayed to admit a student because they just tried something once or twice and they, showed evidence of curiosity. Because once you get to college, it's like a factor change, and like how many more opportunities there are, how many more experiences you can have that are really new. So, we want to see people who are exploring, and it's okay if you don't, commit to every single activity that you do. But I think, when we go and, when we get the applications by the time they're seniors, it is quite important for a student to have, 1 or 2 things, like I mentioned, that really define their time in a major way. And I think that it looks different for every student. Like for some people, it's athletics. I often find that athletes have actually not a lot of room for other activities, and that's okay, right? Because of like the practices and all the things they have to do, like travel. And I think if you're a non-STEM student, that's another trend that we started to see, and that, colleges still experience today, where, maybe there aren't as many explicit things that you are doing that maybe a lot of other students are doing. And that's okay, right? Your activity list might look a little bit more like choppy, right? You might be kind of spread out over 4 or 5 things that you really like, or maybe like a specific program that only accepts juniors and seniors. And that's okay, right? Because I think in STEM, there's just so many opportunities, a lot of interest in those kinds of programs that sometimes the non-STEM students feel like a little bit lost in what to do. So just know that admission officers feel that that's okay, right? You don't have the same, I don't know, academic competitions and robotics and stuff like that, that the STEM kids do. So you won't be penalized, for not having that 1 or 2 very specific things that define your academic profile.
Yeah, and this definitely ties into my next question for the 2 of you. And with all of these different activities, and some of them are a bit hard to explain, how are students being evaluated, especially when they have such a limited space to actually write out and explain what that activity is? So Daniel, I'd love to start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with maybe more of like the logistical answer here. So in your activities resume, you have 10 slots if you're not already familiar. So this will be more relevant to our younger students here. So 10 slots, 10 activities. You don't have to use all of them, just FYI. Most students will have maybe like, 5 to 10 somewhere in there. And then you can also just list off titles for 5 honors or awards that you might have gotten. Again, not required. Not every student has 5. Most students will have 0 to 1, I would say, for the honors and award section. But the hard part logistically is actually really boiling down, potentially 4 years of involvement. Like if we look at the Classic Rock Appreciation Club, where this student is a founder and a president, I mean, they've spent a substantial number of hours, over a substantial number of years doing it. And they have essentially the limit of, it boils down to like 1 to 2 sentences that they can write about it. So I think that part of how students are evaluated here is actually as a writing exercise, because it is always harder, if you think about your English classes, to say what you want to say in the word limit than it is to just like, I don't know, start typing whatever's on your mind. You could end up with like a 10-page paper by accident, right? And then you have to edit down. So it's really important that students use this as a self-reflection opportunity. And that's how you get to have such a, nicely concise, but information-rich description about what you've done. So, I really like this particular description when it comes to the Classic Rock Appreciation Club. So first of all, I don't think this is a competitive kind of thing, right? Like it's not like a million people are vying for a certain ranking with this, but I really like how it adds what I call flavor text to the student. So, you could tell that they're just really passionate about this thing. It started with just a innate love for a certain kind of music genre. And then they've used great quantitative data too. So that's a lot of people meeting weekly to discuss bands. Like that's a whole like Twitch stream right there, so that's like a really impressive achievement, considering that this is really just a passion project for a student. It's not clearly something not something that they would ever have to do or be forced to do or feel pressure to do. So I love what it says about the student, and I love how they used numbers, and you could tell 2 or 3 very concise examples to really illustrate their personality, their timeline. All those things fit within 2 or 3 sentences. So I think logistically speaking, they've done a really fantastic job of hitting that nail on the head of being concise and information rich. And you could tell there's some nice self-reflection here going on as well.
Yeah, and Anjali, for students that might have trouble explaining themselves, how helpful is it to have a college counselor that can help review that aspect of the application and really offer their perspective?
I'd say it's absolutely something that we spend a lot of time on at Collegewise when we're working with students. It's tricky to know whether a club is something that would be known by admissions officers or not. How do you portray yourself? How do you add that flavor that, like Daniel mentioned, but also give that high level overview with the numbers of what's actually been achieved? So it's something that takes a lot of time and thought, and there's actually quite a lot of strategy behind this Common App activity section. So the Common App asks you to rank your activities in order of importance to you. And so a lot of students default to where they've spent the most time, but it's almost this extra chance, like a short story memoir, a Twitter memoir of 10 spots that you get to show them who you are again outside of your essays, with a bit more of a broad perspective. So we really like to sit with students, learn from them what they've actually done. A lot of students will say, "Oh, I didn't realize I could put that here. I love playing the guitar. I didn't know it could go on my college application." So we really try to learn from them, tease out their accomplishments. Most students are very humble and don't want to speak a lot about themselves. So we tease it out, but put it in a tone that reflects who they are, reflects what they've done, and still puts their best foot forward for admissions officers.
Yeah. And we did have one question come up from someone in the audience asking about length. So does it look better for a student to have all 10 slots filled or 5 slots filled, but they spent 4 years in those extracurriculars? So Anjali, what do you say to that?
It really depends. I know it's a bit of an annoying answer when it comes to admissions, but admissions officers are very understanding when they see that a student has gone very deep into a specific space, especially if they have achievements within it. So if you've dedicated everything to soccer, let's say, you've played on a travel league, you're ranked within your state, it probably will be your only activity. A lot of your time went to soccer. So that's something to consider, that if you're going deep within a space, you don't need to just add extra clubs for the sake of filling all spots. Um, for most students, I will say that it's reasonable to fill the spots, especially if you work, have family responsibilities, hobbies, internships. All of these non clubs actually do go within the activities section. So if you work at an ice cream shop one summer, if you babysit, if you take care of an elderly grandparent in your home, those are all examples of things that you can put, because again, you're really trying to show where you spend your time.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up as well. We do have babysitter listed on here as family responsibilities. So Daniel, I'd love to hear from your perspective. How do admissions officers view that, taking care of a sick relative or a part-time job?
Yeah, I mean, that can be really critical context. And part of the challenge, I think, like both of you mentioned, because most students, I think naturally just maybe aren't totally humble, but like aren't braggarts either, right? They're kind of in the middle. I think part of the challenge is teasing out that context for a particular student. And this is a great example of how a student spends the equivalent of a full part-time job, 12 hours a week. That's like almost like a full day of working at, let's say, Starbucks on the weekend, right? 2 days in a row and not having a day off. The equivalent of that, caring for younger siblings. And I think, this doesn't necessarily explain the whole context, right? It could be that they maybe are just happy to do it, and that's a role they really enjoy playing. or maybe it's something that's really necessary. So there are other places in the application to kind of complement this piece. But usually when a student has to work or has to commit to family responsibilities, that's something that admission officers definitely want to see. It's not a named job, right? But some other examples in this vein that, help an admission officer understand how the student not only spends their time, but how they're able to spend their time, can be illustrated through family responsibilities, a job that pays money because maybe they need money to supplement themselves as a family, really long commutes. Those are pretty, if you have any commute of longer than like 1 hour one way for any reason, that can be really helpful context because they explain some other, what might be perceived as a deficiency. Those get pretty easily explained away, right? If a student says, I have a required, part-time job, maybe I'm in a single parent household or something, and or both parents work and I have to babysit my younger siblings, and so as a result, you're not going to see that I'm in 4 sports, right, and like 20 clubs at the same time because they have this really substantial time commitment. So it's really important, but I think that's really where working with whether it's Collegewise or even just like a teacher or a counselor, right? I mean, those are really helpful perspectives to have because it's usually that adult perspective that can help to tease out those things in a student's life. But yeah, colleges love seeing that. If that's a part of a student's responsibilities, it definitely shows commitment. It definitely shows responsibility, dedication, time management. These are all really critical skills that are in high demand.
Yeah, and I will add to that. I know you're saying that admissions officers love to see that, but we always recommend students to stay true to themselves. So don't put something on your application that you think an admissions officer wants to see. We don't like that, but that is a great perspective. Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Awesome. So now I want to switch over to some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to the application process. So one question that I'm sure Anjali and Daniel get all the time is, what is the right set of extracurriculars when applying to college? Should I have these over those? So Daniel, I'd love to hear from you. Is there such a thing?
There's definitely not such a thing. So like when I worked at Rice, for example, which is one of the universities where I was an admission officer, we like to look at a lot of data. So one of the data points we looked at is what percentage of admitted students are in certain kind of groups of activities. So one was volunteering, for example. I know there's always a lot of talk about like, oh, you have to have volunteering. I think something like 60% of admitted students had volunteered beyond, like, let's say them going to a Catholic school and it's required, right? So just actual, of their own initiative volunteering, about 60% of admitted students had it. So it's a lot, but that's not a causal relationship by any means, right? Like a full almost half of admitted students didn't volunteer in a substantial way because they really did follow their North Star and their passions lay elsewhere. So the short answer is there's no such thing as having the right set of extracurriculars. But again, as long as you're taking time to explore, you're at least giving yourself the option, right, to find that meaningful set of activities for you. And that's what colleges really want to see as well. They just, like I said, they want to get a sense of what kind of person you're going to be on campus, and the things you're doing should mean something.
Yeah, absolutely. Anjali, do you have anything to add to that?
One piece of context I'll add about admissions is that you are compared to the students within your school or relative to the benchmarks of your school that your guidance counselor or school counselor provides. So sometimes it can even be beneficial to not do the most popular activities that everyone does, especially if you're not that interested in it. So if you go out and find activities that are very exciting for what you're actually interested in, you are more likely to spend more time there and develop and get that skill set that would be really helpful for university. So certainly, even if you saw someone, for me, it was Josh Min, who was 2 years older than me, and he just seemed to do everything right. He was incredible at the cello, got in early to Yale, and I really just wanted to do every single thing that he did. But it didn't make sense for me. I did not play the cello, for example. So you don't need to follow someone who's a few years ahead of you because it's not that formulaic.
Yeah,
I will,
absolutely.
yeah, I will just add though that there are things that will impress an admissions officer. So if you really commit yourself to that activity and you make an impact, if you weren't there, the club would be different. That is a great sign. You spent that time thinking through how to make this club better or this activity better, and you went and tried to continue to grow it or change something about it that was for the better. Those are the kinds of things that I think actually are the right moves, that will go on where admissions officer reads that and they're like, wow, this person started the classic rock club. That's pretty cool. They did all these types of things. So there are certainly going to be notes of what you can do within an activity, that are often, a sure way to have an admissions officer say, oh, this person would be great here on my campus.
Yeah, and I'm sure for both of you that work in admissions, you must receive questions all the time about what are your recommendations? What activities should I explore? So, Anjali, I'd love to know from you, how do Collegewise counselors tackle that question?
Yeah, so College-wise counselors, we really pride ourselves in making sure that we're learning about different opportunities students have. So, what are the extracurriculars out there, the summer programs? There's always a lot of sharing amongst our counselors and creation of just lists and resources. So, when we start working with the student, we can immediately say, oh, you're interested in architecture. Here are some articles you can read or some activities that you might want to be a part of or summer programs that you might find beneficial. So our goal is to learn all that information so our families don't have to do extensive research. So we're really there to be the guide for you as you come up to these big decisions of what to do each summer. When should I plan out my tests? I'm very busy with, let's say, theater in the fall. Should I do I still need to take the SAT then or take it another time? So yeah, I'd say the short answer to it is that we spend a lot of time researching and learning about the opportunities for students so we can give guidance, to each student based off of their personality and interests and aspirations.
Yeah, and I think that's really the only way to do it, to make sure that we are staying true to the student. So my question for Daniel now, we did have a question, and I apologize for calling this individual out, but we had a comment come in about what activities do you recommend for pre-med? And I think there are a lot of STEM students that have this question, because STEM can be a little bit more competitive. So Daniel, I'd love to hear from you. What's your advice on that?
Yeah, and this is probably where I'll like drop the note that, I mean, the three schools that I worked at were Stanford, Rice, and Swarthmore. So a large number of pre-meds at every single year in all those pools. And just to reiterate the point, like overall, big picture, there's no such thing as a pre-med major, at any university in the United States. So there's a lot of, pre-med advising tracks and kind of recommended curriculums, but you could kind of be anyone, as long as you have kind of the right pieces. So I think it's really about what eventually med schools are looking for. So, undergraduate admission officers, obviously they know that if you're applying for a college, you maybe aren't 100% sure yet or prepared yet to be a doctor. But they do look for kind of the hints of what it takes to be a good clinician. And so actually, I would say from my time at working at Rice, I got the best understanding of it because Rice has one of those programs where you can actually apply to medical school and to college at the same time. So sometimes like MD, PhDs would accept 17-year-olds to med school, basically, as well as to college with their application. So it was really fascinating just hearing about that balance that they were looking for. So one thing they look for is, of course, academic promise. So oftentimes STEM students have academic related activities in general. These could be things like math competitions, they could be things like, or math circles, they could be research that you're doing at the school or at a local university, or maybe through some online program, competitive summer, academic programs, those kinds of things. But for pre-med students in particular, I mean, it really has to revolve around life science, right? So it could be even basic biology or chemistry, but oftentimes there's, I would say, like an applied component to it, right? There's some sort of question of like, how does my research help people? You might be analyzing protein structures, right? Through like molecular biology and genetics research. But that's really relevant for things like prostate cancer detection, right? through like, fluid samples and stuff. So usually there's that kind of like, how do I help people with my research, that applied aspect? And there usually is some exposure to research in a competitive pre-med students, process. There's usually a shadowing component as well, where maybe you ask like a local doctor or something like that, or even like, I don't know, a dentist or orthodontist, just if you can kind of shadow them for a few weeks in the summer. But the other side of what they're looking for was probably the most surprising to me, which is the clinician side of pre-medicine. So, can you spend your entire 20s in school, potentially making the equivalent of minimum wage if you, amortize it over a year, because you just, you just want to help people, right? And you'll have that in-person experience. So oftentimes I found that pre-med students also came with a lot of, shadowing can play into that, but just general volunteering, just things that really showcase, their heart. So, pre-meds, really good pre-meds are a good combination of like heart and mind. So it doesn't have to be volunteering, but that was often the most common way, that we would see it. Or it could be a student who, I don't know, built an app that is designed for mental wellness, and maybe they don't have a lot of users, but the intent is there, right? The direction is there. So that combination of head and heart, I think, is really particular to pre-med students. And usually admission officers at the undergraduate level are looking for that balance as well. More students end up applying pre-med in general, FYI, who have like way more emphasis on like the head piece, like the academic, the research, those kinds of pieces, and then don't have as much of the heart piece. So I think, that's really the breakdown. But pre-med is great because you can be a successful, pre-med applicant because there's technically no major for it. And you could be an English major technically and, be a successful medical school applicant. But generally that's what they look like in high school if they're really keen on undergraduate, pre-medical preparation.
Yeah, great answer. And this definitely leads, I keep saying that, this leads now into my last question for the two of you. When it comes to considerations, so Anjali, I'd love to hear from you first. What should students and their parents be considering when building that activities list? And what are some pieces of advice that you have?
I would, so this is at the very final end, Anna, when they're filling out their application.
At any point. So when they're building their application, when they're considering what activities to explore, anything.
So for underclassmen, I would try and explore more activities, knowing that you don't need to report all of them on your common application. So try and spend some time even reading a newspaper, seeing what else is out there in the world. And there might be a cause that you really care about, let's say global warming. If you find that you're really struck by interest in environmental science, then you can see what activities are available in your club or around you that you can get involved with. And that could include volunteering at a nonprofit. It can include taking a class at a local community college around the topic. So take that pause to be really curious. If something captures your interest, try to pursue it. Go to a couple of meetings, see what it's about, and you'll start to get a sense of where you really want to spend your time. I will say that it doesn't need to be a cause. It could just be a topic. Let's say you're very interested in psychology. Are there online courses you can explore? Are there ways that you can give back in this space? Actually, do an internship and see what a psychologist does. Try and see how you can learn more about the topics you care about. And then as you go into being an upperclassman, when you take leadership positions, my biggest advice is not to do anything for the title. Take leadership seriously. Try and be a leader that you would look up to, and see if there are ways that you can make that activity better. And this could be a very small change, right? It could be, hey, I realize that having meetings over lunch means that everyone's stressed out, they don't get enough time to get to class, and you make a small change to make it better. So I'm not saying you need to go out there and solve the world's problems just through your activity, but be really thoughtful of the fact that you have a title, or perhaps you don't, and there are ways that you can be very smart about having that impact. And that's the sort of thing that you can really talk about in your essays or show in your Common App, that I came up with a new TikTok for this club, or I took our very manual newsletter and I figured out how to move it to video communication, and we got so much more club engagement. So when you figure out what your skill sets are and how you can apply it to the club, then you can really shine that way too.
Yeah, and we have a wonderful podcast that talks about you don't necessarily need to be a leader to have a title. And we did receive a great question about a student who loves playing guitar and how you would title that when it comes to the Common App. So Anjali, based off of what you've been saying, what approach should students be taking when it comes to titling their extracurricular?
Oh, I'd say again, it depends, kind of how the student played the guitar. You can keep it as simple as, playing the guitar. But if there's a quirky twist, you can put to kind of the description, or even the title if it's very specific, to where you played it or the type of music, or if you self-taught yourself, then again, you can use that word space to give a little bit more context to who you are and why you did it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Daniel, we'd love to hear from you. What pieces of advice do you have for families and what should they be considering?
If I were like a teenager again, I think I would try and do as much learning as I could broadly about what the different types of, at all levels, like activities at a starting level, or maybe even like careers look like that relate to certain activities. And I think that, if I were in a teenager's shoes, like I would be basically using, like, let's say my two favorite social media platforms, which I'm going to spend time scrolling through anyway, right? Pretty much every day, and dedicate some time to looking up, like, like if you're interested in debate, right? And you're like, okay, I've heard that some people can like travel internationally for a debate. I've heard that you can do this at kind of like a crazy high level. I mean, there's a lot of debate kids who like TikTok their experiences, right? Or like YouTube vlog their experiences. Same thing for research, right? I mean, you can easily look up and Google a Reddit thread, about someone's experience, just, life as a researcher at, whatever school, and try and get a sense of that. Because again, you want this to also still be fun. And I think one of the most boring ways to do it would be it's a good resource, but like buy the College Board Book of Majors, which was published in 2018. And it kind of tells you like, what are the recommended classes for each major, and, what are the types of careers and the kind of activities that relate to, a successful applicant for agricultural sciences or whatever. But I think most of us aren't really willing to just like sit down and read like a 400-page book. But as you're kind of, surfing through different people's experiences on social media, do keep in mind that those are very subjective data points. So, people might feel negatively about a certain aspect of, a certain activity experience, but maybe it could be really fun for you. So just equip yourself with that lens as you're doing that activity, and trying to get a sense of kind of what's out there. Because I think that's probably the hardest thing that exists for most students, is what I hear most commonly, just like, well, like, there's a lot of things I can do, right? But I can't literally join every club, you know what I mean, in freshman year. So like, how do I kind of like focus my time? So I think social media is great. Talking to your friends is great. Talking to your, teachers, your counselor, to us, because we can also give you a sense from your profile of things that maybe you haven't thought of before, that we think would be really enjoyable and really worthwhile for you, and, also help you in your application process. But don't just like try things in like a bubble, right? Like expand your perspective a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up time. I'm sure tons of families on this call this evening have the question, when is the right time to get started with your extracurriculars and building that portion of the application? And, for junior students, is it too late for them to really establish that list? So Daniel, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. If I would say to the parents in particular, especially if you have a younger child, the it's their whole life, that you're introducing them to stuff, obviously appropriately, right? So if you have like a toddler, that you're supposed to put lots of different shapes and colors in front of them to develop their eyesight and their interest. So it's the same thing for when they, go to elementary school. Like you want them to, I don't know, try karate, maybe like see what it's like to get beat up a little bit, or, swing a baseball bat and all those things. So at all levels, it's appropriate to explore. For the juniors, it's still a great time to keep exploring, but I would say it's really the ideal time to think about, use a lens to guide you, right? Maybe you're like thinking, oh, like this is something I'm good at, or you just kind of do an assessment of how you spend your time and you realize you spend a lot of time doing something. That's a great time, like Anjali said, to, find a twist to your activity, find, a new contribution, or you can see like in the rock club, like get a few people interested in it, right? There are lots of ways to demonstrate, budding leadership and or impact. And, like both of the speakers here mentioned, it doesn't have to be flashy at all. I mean, to give you a particular example, like we once at one of the schools I worked at, we admitted a pre-med student, so probably 1 to 2% admit rate, because they had volunteered 200 hours at a nursing home their junior and senior year. That's a lot of hours. That's like, I was like, do you have a sick like relative in this nursing home? And they're like, no, I just like love like volunteering there. But they ended up, we encouraged them to get a letter from the nursing director in charge of like programming, because they were like playing music, they were like changing bedpans, they were like mopping the floors, like they were literally doing everything. And I just can't think of like a better example of someone who like cares about people's health, than someone who does that. And that didn't need any special like, they didn't need an introduction. They were happy to take the student. They didn't need to learn anything. They were like, we need warm bodies to help and make people happy. So I think, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to feel like you're at the end of your rope if you're a junior. There's so many ways for you to, again, demonstrate impact and, flex your leadership skills and still keep growing through your activities.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. That's a beautiful story. But so Anjali, I'm going to finish this off before we move into the Q&A. There is that saying, those who can't do teach. So I'd love to know if the strategies that we spoke about today and some of the advice that we've been sharing are those things that you considered when you were applying to college.
That's a great question. I'd say at the time, I did not have a lot of kind of guidance and resources when it came to the college admissions process. So, in a lot of ways, I felt I learned a lot later in high school. So, it resonates with me hearing about someone who's like, oh, I don't feel like I did that much my first few years of high school. I did activities, but I struggled to find my footing of where I really wanted to spend my time. And it wasn't until I found something that really lit the spark in me that I had this drive to um, kind of spread it elsewhere, which made me into a leader. So I would say that that really did help me in the admissions process. I was fortunate to get a full merit scholarship for leadership to Duke called the Robertson. And I think it was because I found something I was very interested in. There's one thing I'll add there, that leadership is seen in a very specific light of someone who has a title and who is leading a lot of people. But I think impact can be shown in a lot of ways for someone who's maybe more introverted. So, for example, you could start a blog if you like to write, or during COVID, I had a lot of students who became really interested in seeing how COVID impacted macroeconomic trends, or they wanted to understand the biology behind viruses. And they did a lot of research and spent a lot of time in those spaces. And I think that was all very valid extracurriculars that they shifted towards because there was a clear reason. And it was something they were able to explore and put their time towards. And they showed a different kind of leadership, which was still very strong. I'd say where I don't recommend a student spending their time is if it's very contrived. It's sort of like, oh, I'm about to be a senior and apply to college, let me just start a club. I think that comes across if someone isn't really trying to do much with it, or if they've just amassed and collected a lot of titles and they're editor in chief, president of everything, and as an admissions officer, you might think, how could they possibly spend so much time on all of these things, right? So I think being very true to yourself always goes a long way. And then, of course, if you connect with something and you make an impact, whether through a traditional form of leadership or something else, then that's very well regarded.
Awesome. Uh, and for all of you in the audience, I'm hoping that you took notes. Of course, this recording will be made available, but our wonderful speakers have given us some really incredible perspectives. So I'm very excited to shift gears into our Q&A. We have a ton of questions and we won't have the opportunity to get to all of them this evening, but hopefully we will get to most of them. So we did have one incredible question that I'd love to start off with. Daniel, I'd love to hear from you. Is for students that might not have the same resources as other students, is there an approach that they should take to finding research opportunities?
That's a great question. I mean, that was me, right? So our family qualified for free and reduced price lunch at high school and all that. So we were, low income, and I was the first, like I mentioned, to get a bachelor's degree in my family. So, if I were in a student's shoes today, I would say definitely like start with some baseline academic opportunities. So we have some at Collegewise, right? But I think you can also go on like Coursera, or like find a couple like Khan Academy, like find a few online courses that will really like boost your chances maybe of being able to talk to a local university, for example, or email a professor and say, hey, your research sounds really interested. Like I've done all these cool things. But I think just in general, it's quite important if you want to do research to focus on your academic credentials, because that's usually what's kind of looked at most closely for a research kind of position. There are lots of online programs out there. So, we have an internal list here. You can Google some of those that are competitive and that offer things like scholarships, including, potentially for travel. But, don't discount like your, local community college, either. Like you have some really passionate professors at, all different kinds of institutions at, at the college level. And you'd be surprised how few students actually have the courage, to just email a professor and say like, hey, this sounds really interesting. You seem really cool. Do you have any opportunities for high school students? It's always a compliment, when someone asks you and for something and acknowledges, your importance as a person. So don't be afraid to look in your local area, Google local schools, reach out to a few professors. And then of course, there's probably some things happening at your school as well. So you can definitely ask like a counselor, teacher, those kinds of resources as well.
Yeah, great advice. Anjali, you mentioned a lot about leadership. So we have a student here that says they have more than 10 extracurriculars that are all very important to who they are. For students that do have a ton of extracurriculars, how do they approach the application and summarize that?
Yeah, so universities are pretty great at offering spaces for additional information. So I've seen students have kind of continued activity list that they put in the additional information section. For those applying to the UCs, you have a lot more activities that you could include and categories there too. So that's another kind of place that it can come out. And then for anyone who is applying to the UCs. And then essays are also a chance to at least talk about one or two activities in depth. I wouldn't make it into a long list though.
Mhm.
Daniel, is there anything I missed there of places they can put it?
There's just like, did you mention the honors and awards?
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, so there's an additional section within the Common App where you can put honors and awards, as you would guess from the title. So there's a lot of kind of accolades that can come out that showcase an activity that you've done.
Awesome. We have an incredible question about, and I feel like we get this question a lot. And I know that there are certain places that are impacted by COVID and still, are still impacted by COVID so for students that unfortunately just didn't have the time or resources to approach extracurricular activities in their first few years of high school. What advice do you have for them? Anjali, I'll start with you.
So, one thing is that your school counselor will be explaining how your school handled COVID. So, in it, they'll also explain if activities were happening or not, if you were being graded or not. So, that's one place it may come out. So, you can always check with your school counselor to know what was included. But most universities do still have an additional optional essay around COVID and how it impacted you. So if there was something very specific that, maybe your classes and clubs came back, but you had to take care of a family member or something like that when it came to COVID where you couldn't get back involved, then that's a place you can describe it. But I think also, there's just that opportunity to show what you did after that impact was over. And then you can also mention activities that you were doing when you were at home. Perhaps you did something online that was great, or you helped others during COVID in some way. So you can absolutely describe those sorts of things.
Yeah, great advice. And Daniel, what about you? What do you have to say to that?
Um, this is probably more of a logistical point, but I would say like it's not appropriate or normal for like the majority of people to use that optional essay. So like Anjali mentioned, those would be, she's described some really exceptional situations. Like everybody at school, of course, experienced the pandemic, had challenges, but you know, maybe a parent lost a job or someone got sick with long COVID, you had to be home in a really substantial way. Those are really appropriate things to mention because they have substantially impacted your ability to get good grades, engage in school, engage in activities, further yourself. I don't know, do reading or play the guitar, which you always do. Those are you've had a real impact, but just use like the common sense standard because obviously the world, we all went through COVID, everyone had challenges. But if you're kind of on the fence, it's okay to submit something. You won't be penalized for it or anything like that. But just be judicious about, as Anjali mentioned, with the additional information section. That's not a space to write like 2 more essays. It's a space to be concise and let's say you have more activities. Add those in maybe more bullet point form. Because admission officers do have to review every student with that equity kind of mindset. So if someone submits double the page length of another student, when I was in that position, I would often just try and read faster, honestly, because I got to get to everybody and I want to make sure everyone, had a fair shot. So just be judicious.
Yeah, great answer. So before we get to our last question, I am going to launch another poll, and I'd love to hear from all of you in the audience if you'd be interested in chatting further with Collegewise. I'm sure you all have a ton of information to digest from this webinar, but we'd love for you to respond to us there. And for our final question, we do have quite a few questions talking about athletics. So Daniel, we'll start with you. For students that are dedicating so much time to athletics, should they explore other extracurricular activities?
Definitely. I mean, there's no such thing, right, as like the right, as we discussed, extracurricular activity list. But I think, uh, everyone should be doing at least like 2 to 3 different things, even if the 2 or 3 other things are more at a surface level. But of course, it's easy for an athlete to kind of dedicate most of their time to doing that. But this could be a great time to, again, do things that are kind of like low hanging fruit that might not require a ton of commitment. It could be a political or philosophy or some sort of discussion club, right, at school. You could pick up a hobby. Maybe you might have time for like a weekend job or something like that. But I would say it's pretty rare for students to have just one thing that they do. So that's also where these discussions can come in handy because oftentimes we help you see that, I would say 99% of students are like, wow, like I actually do a little bit more than I thought. Like I've kind of got like a little resume going. So that could be a great way to, kind of decide like how you want to spend your time outside of, whether it's athletics or anything else, just that one thing you're doing. And like we mentioned, it's never too late to start.
Absolutely. And I know we are over time, so I do want to be conscious of everyone's evening. So before we wrap up, Anjali, do you have any last words of wisdom to share with the audience?
Um, let's see. Last words of wisdom. I'd say, if you have something that you're really interested in that isn't formally a club or activity in your school, know that there are always ways that you can connect that activity to making an impact. So, for example, I had a student who loved video games, and he ended up planning a video game marathon to fundraise for a cause he cared about. So, there are fun ways to connect where you really like to spend your time with also helping your community too. So, you can absolutely feel free to be creative.
Awesome. And Daniel, you always have words of wisdom. So what do you have for the audience this evening?
Well, I don't know if I can top that. I think that's fantastic advice. I was a big gamer in high school to my freshman year of college detriment. So I love that example. But I think just, reaffirming that it's really important to follow your heart. Like you don't get your high school years back. And you'll hear this at every stage of your life. Like, well, we all admire doctors, we're all grateful. They spend their 20s studying, and they do love it truly. But, just think about what really matters to you, because you don't want to look back and say, all I did for like a third of my life was prepare for college. I think that's not the right way to live. And so if you end up having, a conversation with Anjali's team, again, I've admired them from afar for a long time. They do a really great job of helping you to maybe unlock a few things that, you could really love and be really good at. But that's the right way, I think, to spend your time in high school. Do things you like.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both for joining me this evening and sharing all of this wisdom, the strategies, and of course, the support for the families that are on this call. And I do want to thank everyone in our audience this evening. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you today and answering some of those questions. For those of you who did join us late, so this is being recorded and you will receive a recording after this webinar. And for those of you who did not get your questions answered today, a representative will be reaching out, so feel free to schedule a one-on-one consultation with one of our academic or our program advisors, and they will get deeper into those questions. So thank you all and have a great rest of your evening.